My life, up until that point, had been a study in muted tones. I lived in a world of gray textbooks, beige dormitory walls, and the washed-out blue of a perpetually overcast sky. I moved through the university campus like a ghost, an observer in my own existence, collecting data but rarely participating. The problem wasn't just the loneliness, which was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of everything. It was the gnawing, suffocating pressure of my advanced theoretical physics course. It was a subject of elegant, crystalline logic, and my mind, a tangled mess of anxiety and unspoken feelings, simply couldn't find a foothold. The equations swam before my eyes, mocking me with their clarity. Failure wasn't just a possibility, it was a looming, mathematical certainty. It was this certainty that finally pushed me from passivity into action. My professor, a man whose patience had been worn smooth by generations of struggling undergraduates, had suggested a tutor. The word itself felt like an admission of defeat, another layer of inadequacy to wear like a scratchy sweater. But the alternative was a failing grade that would torpedo my scholarship, and the thought of explaining that to my parents was more terrifying than the prospect of quantum mechanics. So, I found myself standing before a corkboard in the physics department, scanning the sea of handwritten notes and professionally printed flyers. My gaze drifted over them, each one a potential lifeline, until it landed on one in particular. The flyer was simple, printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock. Julian Croft, PhD candidate, theoretical physics. One-on-one tutoring. I make the impossible possible. Below the confident text was a phone number. There was no picture, but the name, Julian, felt solid, classical. It was the bold claim that stuck with me. I make the impossible possible. It was exactly the kind of casual arrogance that both irritated and intrigued me. For 3 days, the flyer, or my memory of it, sat on my desk. I'd pick up my phone, type in the number, then delete it. The fear of intimacy, even the sterile, academic kind, was a powerful deterrent. I was more comfortable with my quiet failure than the potential awkwardness of asking for help. But on the 4th day, after another lecture that sounded more like an alien language than English, desperation won. I pressed call before I could talk myself out of it. His voice was exactly as I hadn't known I'd expected it to be. It was a low, calm baritone, with a hint of something warm and amused just under the surface, as if he were constantly on the verge of a private joke. "Julian speaking," he said, and the simple phrase sent a ridiculous, unearned shiver through me. I stumbled through my introduction, my own voice sounding thin and reedy in comparison. I was Leo. I was in Professor Albright's class. I was, to put it mildly, completely lost. He listened without interruption. I could hear the faint sound of pages turning in the background. "Albright," he mused, a soft chuckle in his voice. "Yeah, he can be a bit dense." For a genius, the small criticism of a shared authority figure was an immediate olive branch. It made me feel like we were already on the same side. We agreed to meet the next day at the campus coffee shop, a neutral territory. I arrived 15 minutes early, a habit born of anxiety. I chose a small table in the corner, a strategic position that offered a clear view of the entrance. I nursed a lukewarm coffee, the ceramic mug warming my cold hands. Every person who walked through the door sent a spike of adrenaline through me. I had built him up in my mind, this disembodied voice, into some sort of physics demigod. When he finally walked in, he was both more and less than I had imagined. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the seams of his tweed jacket, the kind with worn leather patches on the elbows that should have looked affected but instead just looked right. His hair was a dark, unruly mess that he seemed to have given up on taming, and he had the kind of sharp jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. He scanned the room, and his eyes, a startlingly clear shade of green, landed on me. A slow smile spread across his face, and I felt it in my chest like a physical impact. It wasn't just a friendly smile. It was a knowing one, a flash of mischief that seemed to say, "There you are." "Leo?" he asked, his voice even richer in person. He slid into the chair opposite me, moving with an easy, unhurried grace that I envied. He smelled of coffee, old paper, and something else, a faint, clean scent like sandalwood and rain. It was intoxicating. "Julian." I managed, my own name feeling foreign on my tongue. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and the space between us shrank. His gaze was direct, intense, and I had to fight the urge to look away. "So," he said, that smile still playing at the corners of his mouth. "Professor Albright tells me you're having a crisis of faith with quantum field theory." I let out a shaky laugh. "You could call it that. It feels more like the universe is telling me a joke, and I'm the only one not getting the punchline." He nodded, his expression turning serious, though the light in his eyes never quite faded. "It does that sometimes. The trick isn't to get the joke. It's to learn the language it's told in." He opened his satchel and pulled out a notebook and a pen. The simple, academic gesture should have grounded me, but watching his long, capable fingers handle the objects only served to heighten my awareness of him. This was Julian, and my carefully constructed, muted world was suddenly, terrifyingly, flooding with color. The tutoring had begun, but I already knew the physics was the least of what I was about to learn. Our first few sessions were held in the main reading room of the university library. It was a cavernous space with vaulted ceilings, smelling of dust and decaying paper, and the floor polish the janitors used every night. We sat at one of the long, heavy oak tables, a respectable distance between us, the hushed sounds of other students providing a buffer. At least, it should have been a buffer. For me, it was just background noise to the symphony of Julian's existence. I tried to focus. I really did. I stared at the pages of my textbook, at the elegant, terrifying strings of symbols and equations, but my attention was a magnet, and he was true north. I became a student of him, not of physics. I watched the way his brow furrowed in concentration, creating two small, vertical lines between his eyebrows. I watched the casual way he'd run a hand through his perpetually messy dark hair, leaving it even more disheveled. He had a habit of biting the end of his pen when he was thinking, and the sight of his teeth against the black plastic was somehow deeply, profoundly intimate. My mind, which failed to grasp the spin of a particle, could have written a dissertation on the subtle mechanics of Julian's smile. It rarely reached its full wattage. More often, it was a slight, upward quirk of one side of his mouth, a silent comment on a particularly obtuse paragraph in the textbook, or on a question I'd asked that was so fundamentally wrong, it was almost impressive. He would lean in to point at a line of text, and the clean, sandalwood scent of him would drift across the space between us, short-circuiting my brain. His arm would brush against mine, a fleeting contact of wool and cotton, and I'd feel the jolt of it long after he'd pulled away. My notes from those early sessions were a disaster. They were filled with half-formed equations that trailed off into doodles, my handwriting growing increasingly erratic as my focus waned. He was patient, endlessly so. He would re-explain concepts, drawing diagrams on his notepad with clean, confident strokes, his hand moving with a fluid certainty that I found mesmerizing. I was a terrible student, and the guilt of it was a constant, bitter taste in my mouth. I was wasting his time, my parents' money. But the thought of ending the sessions, of cutting off this weekly dose of proximity to him, was unbearable. So I continued the charade, pretending to struggle with physics when the real struggle was with the simple, impossible act of sitting next to him and breathing normally. My internal monologue became a frantic, obsessive loop of analysis. Every gesture, every word, every micro-expression was cataloged, filed away, and examined from 1,000 different angles. When he passed me his pen, did his fingers linger against mine for a fraction of a second longer than necessary? Or was I just so starved for human contact that a simple, accidental touch felt like a declaration? He had a way of looking at me when I was trying to explain my confusion. His green eyes narrowed slightly, his head tilted. It felt less like he was listening to my question about wave-particle duality and more like he was peering directly into my soul, seeing all the tangled, chaotic things I kept hidden there. He was just being a good tutor, I told myself. Perceptive, attentive. It was his job to read my confusion. But the intensity of his focus felt personal. It felt specific. One afternoon, I was trying to work through a particularly difficult problem set. My frustration was mounting, a hot, prickly feeling under my skin. I let out a sigh, dropping my pencil onto the table with a clatter that was too loud in the library's heavy silence. "I don't get it," I mumbled, more to myself than to him. "It's like my brain is made of concrete." Instead of launching into another explanation, Julian just watched me for a moment. Then he reached across the table and tapped my hand with his finger. Just a single, gentle tap. "Breathe, Leo," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You're thinking too hard. Stop trying to conquer it and just look at it." The touch was nothing. It was less than nothing. A teacher redirecting a student's attention. But it landed on my skin like a brand. I could feel the phantom pressure of it for the rest of the afternoon. My entire nervous system was alight, humming with the memory of that tiny point of contact. I replayed it in my mind, an endless loop. The way his finger felt, the warmth of it, the deliberate nature of the gesture. It was a crack in the professional facade, a tiny sliver of something else. Or was it? My mind, ever the traitor, immediately supplied the counterargument. It was a meaningless gesture, a platitude offered out of pity for his struggling, pathetic student. This was the exhausting duality I lived in, a world of soaring, impossible hope, and a world of crushing, logical certainty. And I had no idea which one was real. The touches, however, began to accumulate, each one a piece of data that I couldn't quite fit into any existing theory. They were small, almost imperceptible moments that could easily be dismissed as accidental. Our knees would brush under the table, and instead of pulling away, Julian would just leave his there. The faint, steady pressure was a constant, warm reminder of his presence, making it impossible to concentrate on anything else. My entire leg would feel electrified, my awareness of my own body heightened to an almost painful degree. I'd sit rigidly, afraid to move, afraid to break the connection. One evening, while I was hunched over my notebook, completely lost in a sea of integrals, he leaned over my shoulder to get a better look. To steady himself, he placed a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a quick, incidental touch. His hand rested there, his palm a solid, heavy weight against my tense muscles. I could feel the warmth of it seeping through my sweater, a grounding pressure that did the exact opposite of grounding me. My breath hitched. I could feel the subtle shift of his body as he breathed, could smell the faint scent of the autumn air clinging to his jacket. He was explaining something about boundary conditions, his voice a low rumble so close to my ear, but the words were just sounds, meaningless vibrations. All I could register was the weight of his hand, the heat of his body, the universe of unspoken things that seemed to exist in the few inches between us. He eventually removed his hand and straightened up, seemingly oblivious to the cataclysmic effect he'd just had on my internal state. I didn't dare look at him. I kept my eyes fixed on the notebook, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Was he doing it on purpose? Was this some kind of game? The playful instigator theory was gaining traction in my mind. Maybe he knew. Maybe he could see the hopeless crush written all over my face, in the way I watched him, in the way I fumbled my words whenever he smiled. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. If he knew, was he amused? Intrigued? Or was he just a naturally tactile person, and I was a lonely, touch-starved overthinker projecting my own desires onto his every innocent action? The most potent of these moments came during a session where we were the last two people in our section of the library. The lights had been dimmed, and the only illumination came from the green-shaded lamp on our table, creating an intimate pool of light in the surrounding darkness. We were packing up our things, the soft rustle of paper and the zip of our bags the only sounds. I reached for my textbook at the same time he reached for his notebook. Our hands brushed, a clumsy, accidental collision. But then, his fingers closed gently around mine. It wasn't a handshake or a grab or anything easily definable. It was just a holding, brief, warm, and utterly unambiguous. I froze, my eyes wide, looking at our joined hands on the oak table. His skin was warm, his grip firm but gentle. He didn't pull away. He just held my hand for a beat, 2 beats, 3. My heart felt like it was going to stop altogether. I lifted my gaze from our hands to his face. In the dim, golden light, his expression was unreadable. His eyes searched mine, and I felt stripped bare, as if he could see every secret, every hope, every fear I possessed. The air crackled with a silence that was louder than any words. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. He released my hand, his expression softening into a small, almost shy smile. "Midterms next week," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Don't stress too much. You're getting it." He shouldered his bag and walked away, leaving me alone at the table, my hand still tingling where he had touched it. "You're getting it." He had no idea. The physics was as impenetrable as ever. But I was beginning to understand something else entirely. Something far more complex and terrifying and wonderful. And I was beginning to suspect, with a hope that felt dangerous, that he was getting it too. The breakthrough, when it came, had nothing to do with physics. It happened on a Tuesday evening. We had been holed up in the library for 3 hours, and my brain had long since turned to sludge. Julian, sensing my complete mental collapse, finally snapped his textbook shut. "That's enough," he declared. "My brain is starting to leak out of my ears. I'm sure yours is too. Let's get out of here." Relief washed over me. We packed up in a comfortable silence that had begun to replace the tense quiet of our earlier sessions. When we stepped out of the library's stuffy, overheated air, we were met with a surprise. A sudden, unforecasted downpour was lashing the campus. The sky was a bruised purple, and sheets of rain swept across the empty quad, turning the cobblestone paths into dark, shimmering rivers. I hadn't brought a jacket with a hood, let alone an umbrella. "Well," I said, stating the obvious. "It's raining." Julian let out a low laugh, the sound swallowed by the drumming of the rain on the library's stone portico. Astute observation, Leo, he rummaged in his satchel and produced a small, collapsible umbrella. It was clearly a one-person affair. He popped it open. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." "Where are you headed?" "Whitman Hall," I said, naming my dorm on the far side of campus. "Me too. My apartment's just a block past it." He held the umbrella out, a silent invitation. "Come on. We'll have to get cozy." My heart did a nervous little flip. Get cozy. The words hung in the damp air between us. I stepped under the small circle of protection offered by the umbrella, and suddenly we were in a different world. The campus, the rain, the entire universe seemed to shrink to the small, intimate space we now shared. To stay dry, we had to walk with our shoulders pressed together, our arms brushing with every step. I was acutely aware of the solid warmth of his body next to mine, a stark contrast to the cold, damp air. The rain provided a constant, rushing soundtrack, isolating us from everything else. It was no longer a tutor and his student walking across campus. It was just two people huddled together against a storm. The academic pretense that had always defined our interactions was washed away by the rain. We couldn't talk about physics. The walk was too precarious, the sound of the storm too loud. Instead, we found ourselves talking about other things. Simple things. He asked me what music I was listening to, and I mumbled something about an indie band he'd actually heard of. He told me about the terrible coffee at the grad student lounge and a ridiculous argument he'd had with his advisor about string theory. The conversation was easy, unforced. It felt normal, and that normality was more thrilling than any of our tense, charged silences. As we navigated a particularly large puddle, I stumbled, and his arm instinctively shot out, his hand landing firmly on my lower back to steady me. The touch was immediate, reflexive, and utterly proprietary. It sent a shockwave straight through me. Even after I'd regained my footing, his hand remained there, a warm, solid pressure guiding me forward. He was holding the umbrella with one hand and holding me with the other. The gesture was so naturally protective, so unconsciously intimate, that it made my breath catch in my throat. I was his to steer, his to keep safe from the storm. It was in the middle of this rain-soaked journey, huddled under a tiny umbrella, that the shift occurred. He fell silent for a few steps, the only sounds the splash of our feet and the drumming of the rain. Then, he turned his head to look at me, his face just inches from mine. The streetlights cast a soft, orange glow on his features, highlighting the droplets of water clinging to his eyelashes. His playful, teasing demeanor was gone. In its place was a quiet seriousness I had never seen before. "What do you actually want to do, Leo?" he asked, his voice low and serious, barely audible over the rain. "After all this, after the degree and the exams, what do you want?" The question caught me completely off guard. No one ever asked me that. My parents asked about my grades. My advisor asked about my thesis proposal. Julian was the first person to ask what I wanted, as if my desires were a tangible, important thing worthy of consideration. I didn't have a good answer. My future was a vague, gray fog, a continuation of the muted life I was already living. "I don't know," I admitted, the confession feeling raw and vulnerable. "I've never really thought about it. I'm just trying to get through this." He nodded slowly, his gaze still locked on mine. He didn't offer any platitudes or easy advice. He just looked at me, a deep, searching look that made me feel profoundly seen. "I get that," he said softly. "The pressure in this place. It's easy to forget there's a world outside the campus gates," he told me then about his own undergraduate experience, about the immense pressure he'd felt from his family to go into medicine, about the terrifying decision to switch to physics, a field he was passionate about, but that offered no clear, stable career path. He spoke of his own fears, his own uncertainties. It was a moment of pure, unexpected vulnerability. He wasn't the confident, all-knowing tutor anymore. He was just Julian, a guy who was also just trying to figure things out. That moment of softness, of shared humanity under the drumming rain, changed everything. The attraction I felt for him, which had been a confusing mix of physical desire and intellectual admiration, deepened into something more solid, more real. It was a connection that went beyond the charged touches and intense gazes. It was the feeling of being known. By the time we reached my dorm, the rain had softened to a drizzle. We stood at the entrance, reluctant to break the spell. "Thanks for the umbrella," I said, the word feeling inadequate for what he had actually shared. "Anytime, Leo," he replied, his voice soft. His hand was still on my back. He didn't seem to have realized it was there, or perhaps he didn't want to move it. He finally let it drop, and the loss of contact was a sudden, sharp ache. He gave me a small, genuine smile, not the teasing smirk I was used to, but something gentler. "Get some rest, and stop trying to conquer the universe. Just try to understand one equation at a time." I watched him walk away, his tall frame disappearing into the misty night. I went up to my cold, empty room, but I didn't feel cold or empty. I felt warm from the inside out. The world was still gray, the rain was still falling, but something fundamental had shifted. A little pocket of color had opened up in my life, and it was the exact shade of Julian Croft's eyes in the rain. The week of midterms arrived like a slow-moving weather front, the pressure building in the air until it felt thick and hard to breathe. Our sessions grew more intense, more focused, but the underlying tension had changed. It was no longer just my frantic, one-sided pining. After our walk in the rain, something new existed between us, a shared awareness, a hum of unspoken potential that vibrated in the small space between our chairs in the library. He looked at me differently. The teasing was still there, but it was softer now, laced with a new kind of intimacy. The touches were less frequent, but more deliberate. A hand on my forearm to draw my attention, a nudge of his foot against mine under the table. Each one felt like a question he was asking, and I had no idea how to answer. The day before my exam, we met for a final review session. The main reading room was packed, a hive of frantic, last-minute studying. The air was buzzing with a collective anxiety that was contagious. We could barely find 2 seats together, and the constant scrape of chairs and rustle of pages made it impossible to concentrate. After 20 minutes of frustrating, stop-and-start progress, Julian leaned back in his chair, a look of profound annoyance on his face. "This isn't working," he said, his voice a low growl of frustration. He gestured at the crowded room. "We can't get anything done here. There are too many distractions." He pinned me with a direct look, and for a second, I thought he was referring to me as the distraction. Then he continued, "We need somewhere quiet, somewhere we can actually focus." He paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. A new idea seemed to dawn on him. "Wait, I can book one of the private study rooms in the graduate wing. They're small, but they're soundproof." He pulled out his phone, already tapping at the screen. "We need a quiet space. No distractions." He looked up at me, a glint in his eye that I couldn't decipher. "Just us. We can lock the door. Just us. Lock the door." The words echoed in the cavern of my mind. It was a perfectly logical suggestion, a practical solution to a practical problem. But coming from him, in that moment, the words felt heavy with implication, freighted with 100 unspoken possibilities. A private room, an enclosed space, a locked door. My heart started to beat a frantic, uneven rhythm. I could only nod, my throat suddenly too dry to form words. An hour later, I was following him down a quiet, deserted corridor in a part of the library I had never been to before. The graduate wing was silent, almost reverent, the air still and cool. He stopped in front of a heavy wooden door with a small, rectangular window set at eye level and a simple brass number, 3B. He unlocked it with a keycard and pushed it open, holding it for me to enter. The room was tiny. It was hardly bigger than a closet, containing only a small table and 2 chairs. The walls were lined with empty bookshelves, and the air was stuffy, smelling faintly of old wood and dust. The single fluorescent light overhead cast a sterile, humming glow. Julian stepped in behind me and closed the door. The latch clicked shut with a sound of shocking finality. The silence that fell was absolute. It was a dense, heavy silence, completely different from the hushed quiet of the main reading room. Out there, the silence was full of the ghosts of other people. In here, the silence was full of us. We sat down opposite each other. The table was so small that our knees were almost touching. The proximity was overwhelming. In this cramped space, there was nowhere to hide, nowhere for my gaze to drift. He was the only landscape. I fumbled with my textbook, my hands shaking slightly as I opened it to the correct chapter. I could feel his eyes on me, a steady, unnerving weight. "Okay," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the small room. "Let's start with quantum entanglement." Julian didn't look at the book. He just kept watching me, a small, enigmatic smile on his lips. "You get distracted easily, don't you, Leo?" he said, his voice a soft murmur. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. And the way he said it, the knowing look in his eyes, sent a jolt of heat through my entire body. He knew. He had to know. He wasn't talking about the noise in the library. He was talking about this. About the thick, charged air in this tiny room. About the way I couldn't meet his gaze for more than a few seconds at a time. Sometimes, I stammered, my face flushing. The library was just loud. Right? He said, the single word dripping with unconvinced amusement. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, closing the remaining distance between us. His sandalwood scent filled the small space, and it was all I could do to keep breathing. "The problem is," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a conspiratorial whisper, "that entanglement isn't something you can understand just by looking at the equation." He tapped the page with his finger. "You have to feel it. The idea that 2 particles can be so connected that they behave as one system, no matter how far apart they are." He looked up from the book, his green eyes boring into mine. "A shared state," he murmured. "Instantaneous. Inseparable." He wasn't talking about particles anymore. We both knew it. The subtext was so thick I could have choked on it. This was a confrontation, but one without accusations or demands. It was a test. He was laying the words out, these loaded, scientific terms, and waiting to see if I would understand their other meaning. Waiting to see if I would meet him in this space between the lines. My mind was racing, a chaotic mess of fear and hope. This was it. This was the moment where the muted, observational life I had been living could crack open and become something else entirely. All I had to do was be brave enough to let it. I couldn't focus. It was an impossibility. The words on the page were a meaningless jumble of symbols, a language I no longer had any access to. My entire consciousness had narrowed to the man sitting across from me, to the stifling intimacy of the small room, to the electric current that seemed to flow in the air between us. We tried to work. He would ask a question, and I would give a nonsensical answer, my mind a complete blank. I messed up a fundamental equation, one I had successfully navigated dozens of times before, writing a plus sign where a minus should have been. It was a stupid, careless mistake, and the shame of it was a hot flush that crawled up my neck. I slammed my pencil down on the table, the sharp crack echoing in the profound silence. "I can't." I choked out, the words tasting like failure. "I'm sorry. I can't think." I buried my face in my hands, my elbows on the table. I was embarrassed. I was frustrated with myself, with my stupid, uncontrollable reactions to him. I was ruining this, whatever this was. The silence stretched. I expected him to sigh, to express his frustration, to tell me to get a grip. Instead, there was only quiet. After a long moment, I felt a gentle pressure on my arm. I risked a glance up through my fingers. Julian had leaned across the table, his expression no longer amused or teasing. It was soft, patient, and intensely focused on me. "Leo," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Look at me." I slowly lowered my hands. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, desperate beat. I met his gaze. His green eyes were dark with an emotion I couldn't name. "What's going on?" he asked. It wasn't a casual question. It was a demand. He wanted the truth. And in that moment, in that tiny, soundproof room, I was too exhausted to lie anymore. The pretense of being just a student, the facade of academic struggle, it all crumbled away, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. The confession tumbled out of me, not in a rush, but in a quiet, defeated whisper. "It's you," I said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. I couldn't look at him as I said it, my eyes fixed on a scratch in the surface of the oak table. "I can't think when you're this close. I can't think at all." I braced myself for the reaction. Rejection, awkwardness, pity. I expected him to lean back, to put distance between us, to clear his throat and professionally suggest we end the session. But none of that happened. The silence that followed my admission was not empty. It was filled with a palpable, humming tension. I finally dared to lift my eyes to his face. He was watching me, and a slow, beautiful, knowing smile was spreading across his lips. It was a smile of pure revelation, of confirmation. He didn't look shocked or disgusted. He looked relieved. He looked like he had just been given the answer to a question he had been asking for a very long time. "Good," he breathed, the word a soft puff of air. He pushed his chair back, the sound loud in the quiet room, and stood up. For a terrifying second, I thought he was leaving. But he didn't move toward the door. He walked to the small, rectangular window set in it, and, with a deliberate motion, drew the thin, flimsy gray curtain across it, plunging the room into a slightly dimmer, more private light. He turns back to me. The playful instigator is gone, replaced by someone with a quiet, unnerving certainty. He moves with a slow, deliberate grace that makes my breath catch. "Good," he says again, his voice a low murmur that vibrates right through me. Because I haven't been thinking about quantum mechanics for weeks. My world tilts on its axis. He walks the few steps back to the table, to where I am sitting, frozen, my mind reeling, my heart doing a painful, hopeful flip in my chest. He doesn't say another word. He simply reaches down, his hands strong and sure on my arms, and lifts me from my chair. He lifts me as if I weigh nothing at all. He turns me and sits me on the edge of the sturdy oak table. The surface is cool against the back of my legs. My feet dangle, inches from the floor. I am elevated, exposed, completely at his mercy. Then he moves. He steps between my legs, his body pressing into the space I have made for him. He gets behind me, his front pressing firmly against my back. One of his arms comes around my waist, his hand resting on my hip, a gesture that is both a steadying anchor and an undeniable claim. His other hand comes to rest on the table beside me, caging me in. He leans in, his chest a solid, warm wall against my shoulder blades, his chin brushing against my shoulder. His breath is warm against my ear. The clean, sandalwood scent of him envelopes me, and I feel dizzy with it. "Let's try this again," he whispers, his voice a deep, resonant vibration that I feel in my very bones. His free hand reaches forward and points to the open textbook in front of me, his finger tracing the very equation I had failed so spectacularly just moments before. From a different angle, he begins to speak, his voice a low, hypnotic murmur in my ear. He's explaining the equation. He's actually, impossibly, tutoring me. But the words are just a medium for the real message. The real message is in the solid weight of his body against mine, the possessive heat of his hand on my hip, the ghost of his lips against my skin as he speaks. It is the most intense, most profound physical contact I have ever experienced, and we are still fully clothed, looking at a physics textbook. The academic context is absurd, a flimsy cover for the raw, undeniable intimacy of the moment. I can feel the steady, calm beat of his heart against my back. And for the first time in my life, I feel the frantic, chaotic rhythm of my own heart begin to slow, to match his. I wasn't a particle anymore, spinning alone in the void. We were an entangled pair, a shared state, inseparable. The lesson, if it could be called that, continued for another 10 minutes. Julian's voice remained a steady, low murmur in my ear, the words about physics flowing over me without penetrating my consciousness. My entire being was focused on the physical reality of him. The solid pressure of his chest against my back, the firm grip of his hand on my hip, the rhythmic puff of his warm breath against my neck. It was a state of heightened sensory awareness, a strange, suspended moment in time. The absurdity of the situation, being held so intimately while ostensibly reviewing quantum theory, was not lost on me, but it was overshadowed by the profound rightness of it. It felt like a lock clicking into place, a puzzle piece I didn't even know was missing finally finding its home. When he finished explaining the concept, he didn't move away. He just fell silent. His hand remained on my hip, his body still pressed against mine. The only sound in the tiny, soundproof room was the soft whisper of our breathing. In that silence, the dynamic shifted again. The pretense of the lesson dissolved completely, leaving only the raw, unspoken truth of what was happening between us. He slowly, deliberately, rested his chin on my shoulder, his cheek brushing against mine. The touch of his skin against mine was electric. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against his, a silent surrender. After what felt like an eternity, he sighed softly, a sound of contentment, and straightened up. The loss of his body heat against my back was immediate and sharp. He took a step back, and I felt a pang of irrational panic, a fear that he was about to walk away and pretend none of it had happened. But he didn't. He just looked at me, his expression soft and unreadable in the dim light. I was still perched on the edge of the table, feeling foolish and exposed. He reached out and gently took my hand, helping me slide back down to my feet. My legs felt unsteady, as if they might not hold me. We packed our bags in a new kind of silence. It wasn't the tense, questioning silence of before, nor was it the comfortable quiet of established friendship. It was a fragile, shimmering silence, thick with the weight of what had just transpired. I couldn't look at him. I was terrified of what I might see in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or amusement at my easy capitulation. My overthinking brain, which had been blissfully dormant for the last 15 minutes, roared back to life, flooding me with doubt and anxiety. I had confessed. He had responded. But what did it mean? Was it just a moment of curiosity? A game? He opened the door to the study room, and the sterile light of the hallway felt harsh and intrusive. We walked down the deserted corridor side by side, a careful foot of space between us. The easy proximity we had shared just moments before was gone, replaced by a sudden, jarring distance. He was quiet, his face set in a neutral expression that gave nothing away. My own mind was a whirlwind of confusion. The glorious, grounding certainty I had felt while in his arms had evaporated, leaving behind a residue of fear. I had crossed a line, and I had no idea what was on the other side. We exited the library into the cool night air. The campus was quiet, the moon a pale sliver in the inky sky. We stood on the steps, the moment stretching awkwardly between us. This was where we usually parted ways. I braced myself for a quick, see you later, a brusque into an evening that had upended my entire world. My heart ached with the anticlimax of it all. Well, good luck on your exam tomorrow, I mumbled, my eyes fixed on the pavement. He didn't respond immediately. I chanced to glance at him. He was looking at me, his brow furrowed slightly, as if he were trying to solve a difficult equation. I started to turn away, the rejection I was so sure was coming already a bitter taste in my mouth. Julian, Leo, he said, his voice stopping me. I turned back. He took a step closer, closing the distance between us. He reached out and took my hand. It wasn't a fleeting touch this time. His fingers laced with mine, a firm, warm, possessive grip. He held my gaze, his eyes serious and direct. The streetlights reflected in their green depths. Next week, he said, his voice low but clear. Same room. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A promise. He gave my hand a final, firm squeeze, a silent reassurance that felt more powerful than any spoken words. Then he released me, turned, and walked away into the darkness, leaving me standing on the library steps, my hands still tingling, my mind still reeling, but with a single, clear thought cutting through the chaos. Next week. It was everything. It was the confirmation I desperately needed. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't the end. It was, impossibly, the beginning. The week that followed was one of the longest of my life. I floated through my midterm exam in a daze, the answers coming to me with a surprising clarity. For once, the equations seemed simple, their logic straightforward. My real mental energy was consumed by a single, looping question: what was Julian thinking? The reassurance of his final words warred with a lifetime of ingrained self-doubt. The memory of his body pressed against mine was a constant, warm hum beneath the surface of my thoughts, a source of both exquisite pleasure and agonizing uncertainty. I replayed our last encounter in the study room 1,000 times, analyzing every detail. The way he'd drawn the curtain, the low timbre of his voice, the possessive weight of his hand on my hip. These were the facts, the data points. But my interpretation of them swung wildly from one extreme to the other. One moment, I was filled with a soaring, giddy hope. He wanted me. The connection was real, mutual. The next, I would be plunged into a cold pit of fear. I was a novelty to him, an amusing diversion. He was a confident, experienced grad student, and I was a shy, fumbling undergraduate. He was probably just playing with me, and next week he would laugh it off, or worse, not show up at all. This internal battle was the true test. It was a test of my own courage. Could I trust the feeling, the undeniable connection I had felt in that room? Or would I let my fear and anxiety sabotage it before it even had a chance to begin? The old Leo, the observer, the ghost, would have found an excuse to cancel. He would have sent a polite, cowardly email claiming he was sick or that he no longer needed tutoring. He would have retreated back into the safety of his muted, gray world. But something in me had shifted. The touch of Julian's hand, the promise in his eyes, had woken up a part of me I didn't know existed. A part that was willing to risk heartbreak for the possibility of something real. A part that wanted, desperately, to be seen. So I chose to trust. I chose to hope. I spent the week in a state of suspended animation, waiting for our appointed time. When the day finally arrived, my stomach was a knot of terrified excitement. I walked to the graduate wing of the library with my heart pounding in my ears. Every step was a battle against the urge to turn and run. I reached the corridor, the same quiet, deserted hallway. I saw the door. 3B. I paused in front of it, my hand hovering over the handle. This was the final moment of choice. I took a deep breath, and I pushed the door open. He was already there. He was sitting at the small table, not in his usual chair, but in mine. The textbooks were stacked neatly to one side, unopened. He wasn't reading or writing. He was just waiting. When I walked in, he looked up, and the expression on his face shattered all my remaining doubts. It was a look of profound, unguarded relief. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "I was hoping you'd come," he said, his voice soft. I closed the door behind me, the soft click sealing us in our private world once more. "You said to." I replied, my own voice a little shaky. "I did," he acknowledged. He stood up and walked towards me. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of me, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He reached up, not to touch me, but to gently push a stray lock of hair from my forehead. The gesture was so tender, so unexpectedly gentle, it made my breath catch. "Leo," he began, his voice serious. I don't know. I should have said more the other night. I didn't want to push you. I wanted you to have the choice to come back. I'm here," I whispered. "You are," he said, his smile returning. From our very first meeting in the coffee shop, I knew. There was something. I told myself I was just being a good tutor, paying attention. But it was more than that. Tutoring you was just an excuse. An excuse to be near you. His confession was simple, direct, and it unraveled the last of the anxious knots in my stomach. It was real. I wasn't imagining it. He felt it too. All this time, while I had been obsessively analyzing his every move, he had been engaged in his own quiet pursuit, creating opportunities for us to be close, waiting for me to be ready. He gestured to the table. "I don't think we need these today," he said, nodding toward the stack of physics books. He took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, a mirror of his gesture a week ago, but this time it felt different. It wasn't a parting reassurance, it was a beginning. He led me to the table, and we sat down, not opposite each other, but side by side, our hands still joined between us on the cool oak surface. There was no grand, passionate kiss, no dramatic declaration of love. There was something better, something quieter and more profound. We just sat there, in the silence of our little room, holding hands. I looked at our joined fingers, his strong and tanned against my paler, slighter ones. The simple, honest contact was the most intimate thing I had ever experienced. There was no pretense, no subtext, no game. It was just us, Julian and Leo. I leaned my head against his shoulder, and he responded by tightening his grip on my hand and leaning his own head against mine. We didn't need to talk. Everything that needed to be said was communicated in that simple, shared touch. The yearning, the anxiety, the hope, it all settled into a feeling of profound, peaceful rightness. Looking at our hands, resting there on the table, I felt the last vestiges of my old life fall away. The fear, the loneliness, the feeling of being an outsider looking in, it all felt distant, like a memory from someone else's past. I was no longer a passive observer. I was here. I was a participant. I was half of this entangled pair, bound to the person beside me by a force more powerful and mysterious than anything in my textbooks. The gray, muted world I had lived in for so long was gone. In its place was this quiet, warm, sunlit room. It wasn't a grand, explosive beginning, but a quiet, steady one. It was the feeling of a door opening, not a door to a tiny study room, but a door to the rest of my life. And for the first time, I felt like I'd come home.